When Louis Armstrong left New Orleans in August 1922, nobody threw him a party. Nobody wrote about it in the newspaper. Nobody stood on the platform at Union Station and said, "There goes the future of American music. We should remember this moment." Louis was 21 years old, carrying a cardboard suitcase and a cornet and almost nothing else, boarding a train north to Chicago to join King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band. The city that had made him, that had given him the streets and the music and the poverty and the violence and the beauty that would fuel everything he ever created, watched him leave without notice. He was just another young black man leaving the South, which hundreds were doing every week during the Great Migration. New Orleans didn't know what it had, didn't understand what it was losing, and for the next 30 years, as Louis Armstrong became one of the most famous human beings on the planet, as his music defined an era, as his trumpet playing changed what the instrument could do, as his recordings sold millions and his name became synonymous with American music itself, New Orleans largely looked away. The city that made Louis Armstrong was slow to claim him, slow to celebrate him, slow to understand that the boy from the battlefield had become the greatest ambassador any city had ever produced. And when New Orleans finally did embrace Louis Armstrong, the embrace was complicated by everything that had come before. The decades of neglect, the persistence of the racism that had shaped his childhood, and Louis's own complicated feelings about a place he loved completely and had been failed by repeatedly. This is the story of Louis Armstrong and New Orleans, a love story, a betrayal story, and eventually a reconciliation story, though one that arrived later than it should have and was never as simple as either party might have wished. Louis Armstrong was New Orleans in every sense that mattered. The music that came out of him was the distillation of everything the city produced. The brass band traditions, the blues, the ragtime, the improvised interplay, the funeral marches that became second-line celebrations, the Creole musical culture that mixed African and European influences into something entirely new. When Louis played, you could hear Congo Square in the percussion of his phrasing. You could hear the spirituals his mother Mayanne sang in the emotional directness of his melodic choices. You could hear the street vendors' cries of his childhood in the vocal quality of his trumpet tone. Louis Armstrong was New Orleans given human form, New Orleans. Rendered as music, he'd grown up in the hardest circumstances the city offered. The battlefield neighborhood, named for the constant violence of its streets, was where Louis spent his early years, watching his mother struggle, watching his father be absent, watching older musicians and learning from them, watching the world in a way that children who are trying to survive always watch, with total attention and nothing taken for granted. The city was beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. There was music everywhere, and so was poverty. There was community, and so was violence. There was the genius of improvisation happening on street corners, and there was the brutality of Jim Crow operating on every other street corner simultaneously. New Orleans also gave Louis his first musical community, the neighborhood bands, the older musicians who recognized something in this eager kid and let him hang around. Peter Davis at the Colored Waifs Home for Boys, who put a cornet in Louis's hands after his reform school stint and changed everything. King Oliver, who watched Louis develop and eventually invited him north. The city provided all of it, the culture, the tradition, the mentors, the foundation on which Louis would build an international career. He never forgot any of it, carried New Orleans with him everywhere he went. But New Orleans also showed Louis its ugliest face early and often, the racism that governed every aspect of Southern black life, the limitations placed on black ambition, black movement, black possibility, the constant reminders that brilliance didn't exempt you from being treated as inferior. Louis watched talented musicians he knew be crushed by these limitations, watched them struggle and fail not because they lacked ability, but because the system was designed to prevent their success. He understood young that staying in New Orleans meant accepting those limitations. Going north meant something different might be possible. When Louis left in 1922 and began building his career in Chicago and then New York, New Orleans should have been watching with pride, but the city's attention was elsewhere. Jazz was already being displaced in New Orleans by other musical interests, and the musicians who'd helped create it were moving north in large numbers. The Great Migration was draining New Orleans of black talent and population as people sought opportunity in cities with less brutal racial policies. The city was contracting rather than expanding, looking backward rather than forward. as Louis's fame grew through the late 1920s and 1930s. As his recordings became nationally famous, as he crossed over into mainstream white audiences in ways no black jazz musician had managed before, New Orleans noticed but didn't celebrate. Part of this was simple racism. The city's white establishment had no interest in honoring a black man's success. Part of it was the complicated snobbery of the music world, where New Orleans traditionalists could criticize Louis's commercial mainstream success even while acknowledging his talent. And part of it was the practical reality that Louis rarely returned. Why would he? New Orleans in the 1930s was still deeply segregated, still operating Jim Crow policies, still a place where a famous black man couldn't stay in any hotel he chose or eat in any restaurant he wanted. Fame didn't exempt you from humiliation in the South. The absence of return reinforced the absence of recognition. Cities celebrate their famous sons most enthusiastically when those sons come back and give the city the opportunity to attach itself to their glory. Louis didn't come back, and so New Orleans couldn't easily build a story around its connection to his success. He was the famous son who had left and not returned, which is a harder narrative to construct than the famous son who comes home and weeps at the city limits. There were also specific incidents that complicated any easy homecoming. When Louis did visit New Orleans in the 1930s, the city's Jim Crow infrastructure reminded him immediately of why he'd left. Being treated as second class despite being internationally famous was a particular kind of insult, worse in some ways than being treated poorly before you'd achieved anything, because it made clear that achievement didn't change the fundamental terms of your relationship to the place. Louis's experiences visiting the South generally reinforced his preference for staying away. Other cities were more willing to honor Louis on terms he could accept. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, cities where the racism was real but less rigidly institutionalized in every public space, where Louis could at least move through the world with some semblance of dignity. Europe, where he was received not as a famous black American, but simply as a musical genius of the first order, where hotel rooms and restaurants didn't require navigating humiliation. Louis had options for where to be celebrated. New Orleans wasn't offering good enough options. The turning point came in 1949, and it came not from the white establishment of New Orleans, but from the black community's own institutions. The Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club, one of the oldest and most culturally significant black organizations in New Orleans, named Louis Armstrong their King of Zulu for Mardi Gras 1949. The honor was enormous. Zulu Mardi Gras had been a black cultural institution since 1909, a parallel celebration to the white Mardi Gras with its own king and courts and processions. Being named King of Zulu meant being honored by New Orleans's black community in the deepest, most culturally meaningful way available. Louis accepted. And when he came back to New Orleans for Mardi Gras 1949, riding on a float through the streets of the city that had made him, dressed in the traditional Zulu regalia of grass skirt and blackface makeup that the Zulu parade used as deliberate, ironic commentary on white minstrel traditions, something broke open in him. He cried. Openly, unashamedly, this man who managed his emotions so carefully in public wept as he rode through the streets he'd grown up on, because this was his city receiving him, his people, the community that had given him everything and that he had worried all these years might have forgotten him or resented his departure. The reception was rapturous. The black community of New Orleans turned out in enormous numbers to celebrate Louis Armstrong as their own, to claim him, to say, "This is what we produced. This man came from us. The genius belongs to us as much as to the world." It was an affirmation of belonging that Louis had needed and that New Orleans had been too slow to provide. But it was finally here, imperfect and complicated and real. White New Orleans was slower to come around. The establishment that controlled the city's public honors and official recognitions didn't rush to celebrate Louis Armstrong in the years following the Zulu Mardi Gras. The racism that had shaped Louis's childhood and driven his departure didn't dissolve because he was famous. But gradually, incrementally, the city began to acknowledge what it had produced. A park, then a concert hall. Eventually, the Louis Armstrong New Orleans International Airport, the ultimate civic honor, the attachment of a name to the infrastructure that greeted every visitor to the city. But these official honors came decades late and were complicated by everything that preceded them. The park named for Louis Armstrong is beautiful, The airport bearing his name is fitting, but you can't help noticing that the city's official embrace came long after Louis was famous, long after the community of his birth had already honored him, long after Louis himself had made his life elsewhere and built his legacy without New Orleans' assistance or recognition. Louis's own feelings about New Orleans were lifelong and layered. He never stopped loving it, never stopped acknowledging it as his foundation. In interviews throughout his career, he talked about New Orleans with a warmth and specificity that couldn't be performed. The red beans and rice on Mondays that he associated with home, the particular quality of the music, the way the city sounded and smelled and felt, the people he'd grown up with. When he was sick in his later years, when he was tired and in pain and facing the reality of declining health, he sometimes talked about New Orleans with a nostalgia that suggested it represented something essential to who he was. But he also never moved back, never returned permanently, made his life in Queens, New York, in a house that became his real home, that became the place associated with his legacy. The man who loved New Orleans so deeply that he could bring tears to your eyes talking about it chose not to live there. The gap between love and home, between belonging to a place and being able to live in a place, was never fully closed. The story of Louis Armstrong and New Orleans resonates in 2026 because it's also the story of every person who leaves their hometown for complicated reasons and builds a life elsewhere, then navigates the complicated feelings of return and recognition. The city that didn't honor you until you'd proven yourself elsewhere. The community that claimed you after you'd succeeded without them. The home that made you into who you are and then couldn't fully accommodate who you'd become. This pattern is particularly resonant for immigrants and their children, for Black Americans who moved north during the Great Migration and built lives in cities that were more hospitable than their birthplaces, for anyone who's had to leave home to have the life that home couldn't offer. New Orleans made Louis Armstrong possible and couldn't keep him, celebrated him eventually but only after losing him, attached his name to its airport and its concert hall while he was building his legacy in Queens. The pride of ownership that cities feel about their famous departures has always been complicated by the fact of the departure itself. New Orleans today cannot be understood without Louis Armstrong. The city's identity as the birthplace of jazz, as the origin point of one of America's greatest cultural contributions, runs through him. His photograph appears on restaurant walls and in tourist brochures and at the airport that bears his name. He is claimed completely, celebrated extensively, marketed enthusiastically. The boy from the battlefield neighborhood is now the face of the city that didn't see him clearly when he was there. There's something both beautiful and melancholy about this final situation. Beautiful because Louis Armstrong's connection to New Orleans is real and deep and musically fundamental. Everything he created was rooted in what the city gave him. The pride New Orleans takes in him is not false. Melancholy because the recognition arrived so late, because Louis built his legacy without the city's help, because the official embrace came only after the work was done and the reputation was secured and there was no risk in the claiming. Louis Armstrong left New Orleans in 1922 without fanfare. He returned in 1949 in triumph, honored by his own community in the most meaningful ceremony available. He accepted the honor through tears. And then he went back to Queens, back to his real home, back to the life he'd built in the city that had actually accommodated him and his genius. He loved New Orleans completely. He just didn't live there, and that distinction, loving a place that couldn't fully hold you, building a life elsewhere while carrying your birthplace in everything you do, is one of the most common and most quietly painful experiences of American life. Louis Armstrong lived it with characteristic music and characteristic grace. The city finally recognized what it had, eventually, imperfectly, too late, and better than never, which is perhaps as much as any of us can ask from the places that made us.